Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our live event webinar on college accountability. It is a very exciting week for higher ed policy in Washington, D.C., so I'm sure you are glued to your computers like we are, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us for what I think will be a really lively chat today. Obviously, the Hill is making some big moves on college accountability, and it was some of the earlier phases of this process that inspired this conversation. Joining me today are John Fansmith from the ACE. He's the Senior Vice President of Government Relations, and also Zach Schermele, who's from the USA Today and a really smart reporter on higher education issues, particularly accountability. I am going to pass it off to Zach to moderate this conversation, but to give a few words of background on how we got here today. This is a conversation I'm very excited to have. I was inspired by listening to John on the ACE podcast very recently, raising concerns about the risk sharing proposal that was initially part of the House reconciliation package. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a conversation between he and I, moderated by somebody really well informed on this issue, cue Zach. And so today we're going to be really just talking about, from where we sit, our perspectives on these issues. And I think Zach will have some great questions for us. So Zach, I'll pass it over to you. And thanks to both of you for being here for this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. I'm so excited to be talking about this on what is a very quiet week in Washington here. I'm Zach Schermele, an education reporter at USA Today. For anyone who's not familiar, I cover federal higher education policy, the U.S. Department of Education, and national news about colleges and universities. Like I said, very excited to be having this discussion here. And what we're hoping to chat about is how the new political dynamics here in Washington are really ushering in a new era of accountability for colleges and universities that in some ways is entirely different and unprecedented compared to anything that we've seen before, and in other ways is actually informed by decades of debates and policy discussions here in DC and across state capitals. Discussions about risk, about outcomes, and what responsibilities institutions and students have with respect to those two things. So, like I said, we're talking at a very busy moment, in fact, a historic moment for higher ed policy as the House of Representatives is preparing to vote on a version of a tax and spending bill, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, although I think there's been a name change. It's hard to keep up with all the latest of what's happening on the
Thank
Hill.
goodness there has been a name change.
Yes, that includes some pretty big alterations in the view of some, changes that are too big, and in others' minds, changes that are too incremental in funding for the Title IV student aid programs and other federal programs relevant to students. And as always, with federal funding comes strings attached, and this bill includes some new types of strings that are going to be the topic of our discussion today. So like Beth said, the idea for this chat came out of conversations I'd been having with both her and John about the first iteration of the reconciliation bill that came from the House side of Congress in April. And at that time, there were some very strong reactions on all sides of higher ed policy to the legislation, which has since been watered down over on the Senate side, and we can get into exactly why later. But let's go back to April first. And John, I want to start with you. What accountability provisions did we see then proposed from the House? And why do you think those were included in that particular iteration of the legislation?
Yeah, thanks, Zach, and thanks, Beth, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's great to be here. I think it's going to be a fun conversation too. But in terms of what the House did, they introduced what they call a risk-sharing accountability measure, and it wasn't brand new for the reconciliation bill. The same proposal had been in a bill called the College Cost Reduction Act that had passed the Education and Workforce Committee in the House in the previous Congress. It was really driven by Chair Fox of that committee. She was the chair at that time, and reflected a lot of sort of evolution of their thinking on how to go about pursuing accountability for colleges and universities. But you asked why. The root of this is something that you touched on, Zach, right? For decades, really, we've been talking about how do we ensure that colleges and universities are using the money that goes to students enrolled on their campuses to ensure the best outcomes for them. And there's been lots of proposals. And one thing that's important about is a lot of them are bipartisan. The same concerns are not unique to Republicans or Democrats. There's different policy proposals, different areas of emphasis, but this is a very bipartisan concern that's been going on for a while. That said, the House's risk-sharing approach is a little bit dramatically different than other things we've seen advanced, and it's a very complicated system. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but the simple sort of summary I would give is it looks at students who have left a campus who are entering repayment. It looks at the amount of their loans or student loans that at that point time in future are unrepaid, have not been repaid. It breaks them out into 3 different groups, basically graduate completers, undergraduate completers, and undergraduate non-completers. And then there's a multiplier, again, trying not to be too complicated, that essentially says it's a calculation of how much of an earnings premium, positive or negative, did that specific program generate for those students? Basically, are they earning more than you would expect them to earn or less? And whatever that amount is, it's multiplied by that unrepaid amount. And all of these calculations get totaled up into something for the institution that what it represents is once a year, a school has to send a payment back to the federal government. In almost all cases, the committee's estimates were 90% of schools would have to send a payment back to the federal government. Because it's based on each cohort that comes out year after year, those payments would grow over time. So it'd be a constantly growing penalty. And essentially the goal was to say that schools would have this incentive for ensuring that the programs they offered led to students entering the workforce, earning more than sort of the average and being able to repay their loans on time. And that's what it was intended to do. That was the crux of the accountability provision in the House that they introduced.
And I neglected to mention up at the top here, if you guys have any questions, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of this discussion. So folks who are watching can feel free to email our colleague at AEI, Greg, whose email is listed on the landing page for this event, or tweet using the hashtag AEI risk sharing. And I want to go into Beth, what your reaction was, because I remember having a discussion with you not long after the House's version of this risk sharing framework was released, that, as John said, was largely similar, but in other ways much more complicated than what we saw in the CCRA. What was your reaction then to that particular iteration of the legislation?
So I was a fan of this. I mean, I think that right now we have like a real absence of accountability policy for these institutions, and we have a tremendous amount of spending going into these programs. And so, while I'm a fan of consumers policing the marketplace, in this instance, the government is a huge consumer of education because they are the payer in this case. So I like the idea of putting some colleges' skin in the game, as we said. And, as John pointed out, this is, or maybe it was you, Zach, I can't remember, this is not a Republican idea that institutions should share some of the financial risk that was previously borne by students and by taxpayers. If I go back something like 7 or 8 years ago now, as part of a paper series where I worked with Ben Miller, who has worked for Democratic administrations, and we collected a series of something like 7 or 8 papers from folks across the ideological distribution proposing making very specific risk sharing proposals that could be taken up as federal law. And so the point was, this is a bipartisan kind of like technocratic idea that we need to make sure that where dollars are going is a good use of government resources, just being a good steward of federal taxpayer dollars. So I like that risk sharing takes would have taken a really big step in that direction. I had some concerns about the complexity of the model, although most of the complexity was on the administrative side. I think some of the comments that I've seen John make publicly actually led to me to believe that some of that complexity might actually lead to challenges for institutions that were kind of beyond what I would have anticipated. So I like it in spirit. I was kind of waiting to see, where some of the wrinkles would shake out. I'm not entirely disappointed with where we are with the current version of the bill as a compromise and something that's a bit more simple, but also achieves like a really big step towards accountability for institutions.
Yeah, and I'd love to pick up on sort of where we are closer to now in the next step here. The provisions in some of the Senate portion of the bill took a bit of a bird bath, and I'm wondering, John, if you can explain to us what that is, and what particular pieces of the Senate version of the bill the Senate parliamentarian took some issue with, and potentially why, and sort of how you would compare the House and the Senate version of the reconciliation bill, what you think is worse, what you think is better, and if you feel like there are aspects of the Senate version that are easier potentially to implement.
Yeah, and I we could spend the entire hour talking about the parliamentarian process and reconciliation and the Byrd rules, but just sort of quick summary for people who don't know. The reconciliation moves under a whole set of different rules. That's why it gets to bypass the filibuster in the Senate. But part of that is it is constrained by things that are germane to raising revenue or cutting spending. That's the intent of reconciliation. So there is this process that you talked about, Zach, the Byrd bath, in which all of the various provisions get put before the Senate parliamentarian, a nonpartisan position within the Senate, who relies on precedent and their interpretation of precedent and what evidence exists out there to make determinations on hundreds, if not thousands, of complicated technical matters, and tries to say what is relevant to a reconciliation bill and what is not. And that has a huge impact, especially in the Senate, where it doesn't apply in the House, in shaping the final outcome of it. And it definitely had an impact on what we have seen in the final bill that the House, as we are speaking, is trying to vote on. But one thing that's probably in the accountability space important to think about is the Senate came in with a very different approach than what the House was talking about. The House had this risk sharing, this very complicated payments-based system with annual fines. The Senate never really showed much appetite for picking that up. And what they actually proposed was something that's a lot more in line with what we have historically seen in federal policy, which is to look at essentially measuring the outcomes of programs and saying it's not about paying back to the government. It's saying what are quality programs and what are not quality programs, and how do we determine that? And what the Senate settled on is something I think a lot of people would find pretty reasonable. I mean, I would say I think this is a reasonable approach. It is to say that if you look at graduates of undergraduate level post-secondary education, bachelor's programs, AA programs, certificate programs, they should be earning more than high school graduates. And so you look at a program and you say 4 years after people have graduated from that program, are they earning more than high school graduates in their state? And if they are, great. Programs demonstrating value. If they're not, and they're consistently not, in this case, 2 out of 3 years, then maybe that program shouldn't have access to student loans. And that's what the Senate bill do. At the graduate level, compare it to bachelor's degree recipients. So if you have a master's or a PhD, you should be earning more than bachelor's degree recipients in your state. It's a pretty straightforward approach. It's also very much tied to the individual program's merits, which reflects a lot of things we've seen before. It also gets into stepping away from some of the other proposals we've seen that have looked at things like repayment rates or completion rates, and the one that's currently in law, cohort default rates, which are completely irrelevant after everything that's happened over the last 5 years with payments suspended. So it's a very pragmatic approach. Now, devil's in the details with any federal program, right? Where you measure, what you measure, who you're measuring, when you do that, those matter. And I certainly have some concerns about what the Senate did. But overall, they took a very different course than what the House was talking about in a way that I think appeals to a lot more people generally across the ideological spectrum here.
Was it more appealing to you, Beth? What were your thoughts?
I like it. I mean, it's worth pointing out for context that this is actually both a huge step in the right direction in terms of raising the bar for institutions, but it also stays like at a very low, I mean, it is a very low bar in that, I mean, in that we're not asking that much of institutions. And like John said, it's like, it's pretty hard to stand up and say, no, I don't think colleges should be spitting out graduates that on average are at least out earning people with a high school diploma. I mean, I think, we can disagree about how much the ROI should be on college, right? But I mean, for the most part, this idea of like do no economic harm seems to be something that we could all get behind. And I mean, this isn't even quite that because, you have to exceed the earnings of a high school graduate on average, but that doesn't even take into account the cost of the education. So, I mean, it's a very low bar, but I think it's also, like I said, a huge step in the right direction. And so I'm excited about it. In terms of like people's potential concerns about this, like I think the number one thing that always jumps to top of mind is like, what are the implications for access? Are we taking away people's ability to get education? I mean, that's the center of concern. And anytime we have some sort of constraints on federal aid. And in this case, one, these are only applying to the borrowing side of the equation. So students can still get access to Pell Grants for these programs, even the ones that fail this earnings threshold test. And so really all that we're doing is eliminating access to loans that likely would have been unaffordable for students in the first place, at least empirically speaking. So I think it's really hard to argue that this is not a good policy. And like John said, I think there's like a lot of details to work out that will likely not get worked out until we get to the processes at the Department of Education of implementation. So I think that leaves a bit open to interpretation, maybe more than is ideal, but that's kind of how policy works sometimes. But generally speaking, I'm very excited. I think this represents a shift in the way that our lawmakers are thinking about higher ed and what it should deliver to students and taxpayers. And I think that actually reflects the shift that we've seen in Americans' attitudes towards higher education. Over the last decade or so, we're seeing this increased skepticism about what it is that college does for us as a nation, for individuals. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not colleges are taking this responsibility to deliver people into economic opportunity. And this policy really translates directly to addressing that concern. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, on the other hand, there's a concern, I think, from some folks about eligibility for programs that are needed in certain communities that
Mhm.
might come under fresh scrutiny as a result of the provisions in the version of the reconciliation bill that's likely going to pass. So, my first question, and I remember talking to John about this when we looked at the Senate version with this new, what has been billed by Senate Republicans as a do no harm standard. That's what John was talking about when he was referring to this new accountability framework. Is what kinds of programs could potentially lose eligibility, not, as you say, Beth, for all Title IV funding, so not for Pell Grants, but from the federal lending programs, and what kind of implications could failing this threshold for 2 out of 3 consecutive years have for programs that communities might need?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. This is part of the problem, and it sounds a little bit ridiculous to complain about process, but this is part of the problem of doing something as important as this in the reconciliation process rather than through regular order, where there's more time, there's more possibility for feedback. There are some pretty clear areas, and you're hitting on this, Zach, that we can see where the problems might be. And I think broadly, you can say this is a reasonable approach. It's probably, to Beth's point, a relatively low bar for most programs. But what we also know is there's a lot of program areas where to work in those fields, You will need some level of graduate education generally. There'll be licensure requirements. I'm thinking about things like social work, counseling, educational fields, teachers' aides, librarians, things like that, where the economic returns are not great. And people entering those programs are aware of that. You're not going into social work for the money, right? You're going because this is a field you care about and you feel you can contribute. And particularly if you think about all those fields I just named, they're also ones where we have a really hard time finding qualified people to fill those jobs as it is. The problem is you get into this metric where the only measure of the quality of the program is earnings. In some fields, we know that the earnings will not be great. And so relatively, you will see, and we did some initial data runs at my organization, and what we saw was, where, the distribution of programs that might be at risk, they tended to cluster in those areas. Doesn't mean all of the programs in those areas would fail the test. It just means you see more of those programs than others failing. And that is something that, again, with more time, I want to be really clear. I think the Senate, the senators on the committee, when they put this together, the staff working on this, they're not, indifferent to that, but they're working in a process that doesn't allow for sort of adding out some other elements about areas of high need or areas of greater risk or areas where there might be some protections built in to say, look, these are a little bit different circumstances than we see for somebody in a BA of history program, right? And we could do something for that. We just don't have that bandwidth and reconciliation. And who knows, down the road, we might be coming back and fixing those kind of things. Because again, these are the sort of pretty clear unintended consequences you can predict, looking at it now.
So I mentioned earlier this paper series that I was a part of organizing many years ago. And I think what you just described, John, actually captured some of the spirit of like the crux of the disagreement that was between conservative thinking on this and more progressive style thinking, with the range in the middle, of course. And it was this idea that there are justification for kind of being excused from accountability standards if you're in this area of public interest, like that like maybe we lower the accountability standards for social work programs because we know we need social work. And I'm kind of a hardliner on this because I say like absolutely not, because if it were the case that excusing a program or institution from the accountability standard meant that this cost would get passed back to taxpayers or the federal government, I'd say, okay, fine. But when we excuse institutions from the accountability standards for borrowing, what we're saying is that, yes, we need more social workers, we need more teachers. And our national strategy for getting it is going to be to put teachers and social workers into unaffordable debt. And that's how we fix this problem. And so I know you're not saying that, John, but I'm mischaracterizing you intentionally. But to me, that's what that solution says. I much prefer this hard line that says, no, we do not let people go into debt on the federal wash that we predict empirically will be unaffordable for them to repay. And so we need to make this change, stop the bleeding on that front first, and then let those sort of problems bubble up. I mean, we will see a shortage of people going into the social work profession. Might maybe not happen overnight, but eventually we will see this happen. But my feeling is that the solution to it is not this excused from accountability, but instead other mechanisms, other policy mechanisms. So, like in social work, for example, we know that a lot of social workers are required to have a master's degree. It's not clear to me that this is a profession that requires a master's degree to be able to do the work. I think it's at least worth considering, particularly at the state level, whether or not this is a requirement that continues to make sense in the face of these new accountability standards, should they pass. Or alternatively, they could say, oh, yes, absolutely. Social workers are a critical need and master's degrees are a necessary part of their training. Therefore, social workers, we're going to need to raise the pay at the state level or offer tax credits for nonprofit workers working in the field of social work. I guess my point is that the fixing accountability, particularly when it pertains only to borrowing, eligibility for borrowing, to me does feel like the first step. And then the next step is to like, okay, see where that gets us, and then see who was bearing the cost of there being these, careers and professions that are in the public interest, and then make the corrections afterwards with dollars instead of, through passing on continued eligibility for debt.
I'm going to mischaracterize what you said, Beth, and say I appreciate your
That's
support
the game,
for
right?
universal free tuition for social workers. No, I mean,
Absolutely not.
those are great points, and I think there's an affordability component that we can talk about too when we talk about accountability, and that's also a big conversation as well. And
Yeah.
what does affordability look like, and how do we target that, and what's appropriate? Because we base a lot of our college financing on borrowing,
Yeah.
which does shift a lot of the burden to taxpayers and individuals. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's a real link. I mean, you mentioned cohort default rate. There's a real link between borrowing and accountability. That I like the way you described it, John. It's like an entirely irrelevant accountability metric now because of the repayment pause. And so, I think you can make the argument that there was potentially an accountability framework kind of overdue in the absence of something like that because of the changes that we've seen to repayment over the course of the last couple of years. I want to, so we were sort of getting into this, but, we talked about kind of the politics and where things stand here in Washington with respect to these two visions for higher ed accountability. But I wanted to get a little more philosophical too. So, we all agree, and we've been discussing the degree to which accountability in higher education is important. And I really believe that there are lots of institutions who welcome regulation that they think is reasonable because it can be healthy for the sector as a whole. But, in the same way, there's a certain element of risk in being a consumer of anything, of buying a home or taking out an insurance policy. There's some risk involved with obtaining a post-secondary credential. There's risk for the student who might go into debt that, depending on the program, they may or may not be able to pay back. And then there is some risk for the program and the institution that program is a part of if that student doesn't complete, and, I say complete deliberately because that's an important term to be using with respect to these new accountability provisions in the framework being proposed in the Senate. But what does the right balance of risk look like here? Like, who should be on that spectrum of student to institution? Who should be bearing the majority of that risk, and what does the right balance look like there? Open it to either of you.
Maybe I'll jump in. It's a great question, and I don't know that we've ever really come up with anything that's close to sort of a consensus answer. I'll say, at least from my perspective, there should be shared risk among students and the government and institutions. And I think as you think about what the risks students should bear, and this is one of the reasons I like having these conversations with Beth. Beth's really been very thoughtful about this idea of the risks inherent in the higher education enterprise, right? We want to make sure that there are some policy considerations. The reason we, as a nation, put money into getting students into and through higher education is because it absolutely has a personal benefit for them, but it also has a huge societal benefit, right? The more educated, talented, skilled our workforce is, the enormous benefits it pays in our competitiveness, our ability to innovate, like driving industry. Part of the reason we import so many like engineers and other people from abroad is because we are not producing enough of those as it is. So there are reasons as a nation we want to put money into doing this, and they're self-interested reasons. It's not just that we're trying to help people out. That said, we also don't want to ask so much of students on the risk side that the consequences, especially for low-income students, of it not working out are so punitive that it discourages them from trying in the first place, right? If cost is the biggest factor in a low-income student's decision to attend or not, I think we have about 43 million level and left without a credential. Not all of them borrowed, but a lot of them did. So they have debt with no economic benefit. And so I think when you're trying to think about what is the appropriate level of risk, we have to say there's some level of financial support there that should insulate the risk to low-income students, to say they can try it, they can experience it. Some of that's on the front end. We do that a little bit with grants. Some of it's on the back end. We do that with, or we try to do that with targeted forgiveness programs. And I think that's the right construct, probably not enough on either end to fully insulate those students. But then saying above that threshold, this to me is where the risk to the government and the institution probably should come in. You should say there's a baseline that insulates the student. But then if they're making choices, if they're pursuing a program that is incredibly expensive at a, they're choosing a much more expensive alternative to one that's could be lesser price. If they're choosing in a field like social work, for instance, possibly, where the economic returns are not what they might be. And, this is why I like these conversations with Beth, and say, well, there are choices there that maybe should be incentivized to make different choices. Doesn't mean you can't be a social worker. Doesn't mean you shouldn't go to college. It just means maybe you shouldn't pursue social work at the most expensive school if you'll be relying on debt to finance that. And we can do things where we start to say, if institutions are offering that program, maybe they should be putting more of their own resources towards that. Federal government should think about what the limits of the resources they want to put to that look like. It gets complicated because we're talking about 20 million students at 4,000 institutions across hundreds of thousands of educational programs. And where do you really want the federal government delineating on a person by person or program by program or institution by institution basis what's appropriate? But certainly a much more nuanced approach than the kinds of things we have in federal policy right now, which are sort of a black or white approach, yes or no, here's your max, here's your minimum, move forward. Which doesn't give you a really good answer, I don't think, Zach. but anyway, that's where I've been thinking about these things. But I'm really curious to hear what Beth has to say.
Yeah, I mean, there has been such a tremendous shift, I think, in conservative thinking on like particularly the amount of risk that's bearable for students in this space. So, as we saw prices increase over the past several decades or a handful of decades, students were sort of by default taking on more risk because the original conception of the student lending program really didn't have repayment plans that offered, downside protections in the cases that borrowers really couldn't afford to repay their debt. So, as most people who probably are tuned into this know already, we had this incremental series of piecemeal reforms that created this now universal safety net that protects borrowers from ever having to fully repay a loan that is deemed unaffordable to them, whether whether they think it's unaffordable or not, according to the standards of these existing income-driven repayment policies. So that's been just a tremendous shift where, when I entered the field, I guess maybe 15 years ago, Republicans, conservatives, and even I wasn't really excited about like a lot of the income-based repayment programs that were emerging. But I think there has been this shift in a sense in thinking about higher ed that given that this is really the mechanism for social mobility that our country kind of hangs its hat on and says, we don't offer a lot of the social safety nets that exist in other developed nations, but, we offer this opportunity for mobility, this opportunity to create your own financial well-being. And higher education is like such a critical part of that, that it's sort of untenable for that to sometimes fail or to fail at, decently high rates. And so I think that's been an evolution of thinking about the tolerance that we have for students to bear that risk. You see, for Republicans to be putting forth these solutions, I mean, student advocates probably aren't excited about the streamlining of the repayment plans that we see in the reconciliation bill, but the fact that there's an income-based repayment with forgiveness plan coming from the Republicans is just like, a mile away from where Republicans started on this issue when we first started seeing these income-driven repayment plans on the scene. So I think that's a recognition that students shouldn't be bearing the risk. But at the same time, we're seeing this conversation about risk sharing, which is dropped out of the conversation explicitly in the form that the House proposed. But this spirit that, okay, well, what are institutions doing here? They're just like on the gravy train. We're just sending them money and they're just, taking John out for lunch and, but I think there is this sense that the institutions aren't bearing enough risk, right? Students were bearing too much risk. We fixed that by having this evolution of repayment programs that acknowledges that there's this now universal system that nobody should have to repay a debt that's truly unaffordable to them. Now that's automatically shifted back to taxpayers because of the way that it was by default funded. And then this risk sharing conversation, or even the new accountability conversation, I think is kind of pushing back and saying, okay, let's kind of reallocate where this risk sits, and are institutions bearing enough? And I know I'm not the moderator, but I would love John to just answer or even talk about that sense. Like, do institutions have enough skin in the game when it comes to student outcomes, when it comes to, higher ed delivering this American dream for people?
Yeah, and I think I can safely say that there is not a college president in the world, if you talk to them, or at least in the United States, who doesn't feel deeply invested in the outcomes of their students and doesn't feel, connected to that, and there is absolutely a question about what are those financial incentives, but they play out in a lot of ways. You've talked about the marketplace and consumers driving some of this. People understand programs shift all the time to meet market demands, what's institutions offer, the ways they deliver the education. By and large, cost is the biggest driver of the choices they offer. And a lot of that, especially 80% of students go to public institutions in this country. They tend to be driven by decisions at the state level, including tuition levels that are somewhat out of the hands of the people on the campus to make those determinations. So they are acutely aware of the outcomes of their students, especially as this accountability conversation has moved forward, because look, nobody can't read the writing on the wall. There is bipartisan consensus about, strengthening accountability measures and the direction it's going, this ROI. But this is one of the problems with the House's risk sharing proposal. We start with this framework of risk sharing, and we're good on risk. We haven't emphasized the sharing part enough. The schools very often don't get to control the financial resources the students they admit have. In many cases, they may not get to control how much they charge them for tuition. And they can't control what the workforce will do across a variety of factors, whether that's workforce demand or discrimination in hiring or many other things that we know to be the case. And yet they're being evaluated on those outcomes. And so I think risk sharing is a viable concept as long as there is some element of control so that institutions can reasonably mitigate those risks. Now, I say that, and I think the concern everyone jumps to when you talk about institutions mitigating the risk would be to say, well, they'll stop enrolling students who are the riskiest students. And that's the kind of thing, going back to my earlier remarks, you want to create a baseline where there is some level of accepting students financially, where they're insulated from risk, but that also insulates the institution. Say, if we can deliver a quality education at or around this price point, then the student is protected. We know what we can do with that, and we can tailor programs to that. Going beyond that, if you are making choices to offer more expensive programs, to offer programs that may be of more selective appeal, that's a reasonable place to say, well, let the institution have some control. We had all these federal programs, actually partnership programs, where some federal money is matched by institutional money. Work study, SEOG, we used to have the LEAP program with the states, where you can think about those as models for saying, there's something we can do to say in certain areas, let an institution put their own money in if they think this is valuable. If they think it's important to offer these programs and they can't do it at that level that, an expansive Pell Grant would cover for a low-income student, then sure, they can still do that. They can even get access to some federal money, but the federal money might be offset by a greater portion of institutional money. Those are the kind of things I think would be great policy interventions, because you're giving institutions some control in terms of the risk they're taking on, but still giving them the option of pursuing the things that they think serve their mission, meet their students' needs, work for their communities.
How different is that from what we have on the table today, though, John? Because it's, the Pell Grant, maybe you're saying, maybe you would argue the Pell Grant is too low, to, like, in effect be achieving what you're describing, which is that, you've got covered for the lowest income student, and then above that, students borrow, and then you've got caps on loans. So above that, it's on the institution to, offer that financing, which shifts the risk back onto them. So what sort of changes would you need to, it seems to me like the infrastructure that we have is not totally inconsistent with what you're advocating for.
No, I think that's part of the appeal of it, actually, is that our infrastructure is compatible with it. It's just simply not aligned with it, right? A Pell Grant is less than half of what the average tuition and fees for a four-year public college university is, and that's not cost of attendance, that's tuition and fees. So we are saying essentially to low-income students, and again, not every Pell recipient gets the maximum award. Now, we're saying to low-income students, there is some support for you. We're limiting some of the risk you're taking on, but you'll still likely need to borrow. You'll still likely need to take on this additional debt. That is a real concern, especially for certain underrepresented communities in higher education. Even the idea of borrowing is a barrier to applying. So to my mind, were we to expand that subsidy for those students, you might even balance it on the back end by saying, look, regional public institutions, community colleges, students who are going to those institutions, which is a large portion of the students already in the higher education system, are able to access that without risk. Mm-hmm. Students who are making other choices beyond that, institutions that are willingly taking on decisions to offer programs that might be of lower economic return or of less demand. Mm-hmm. At that point, we're talking about putting in additional resources to say those are now available, but you're taking on a higher risk by pursuing them.
I'm not entirely philosophically opposed to what you described, but here's my concern. Kind of, worst case scenario, you have these institutions basically have this free pot of money, and we have essentially no accountability for that because of what you described, these concerns that, it discourages. I mean, how do you have some sort of hybrid of the two, which is that you make sure that these resources exist to fund the riskiest students, but the institutions are answering for how they're spending that money and the quality of those programs. I mean, how do you pair the two things? Because otherwise I can't get behind it.
I think there's two things there. The first is that by requiring the institutions to put their own money in, they are making some determination as to what they think valuable investments are, right? They are deciding where the places, and they may do it knowing it will take a loss. There's a lot of well-resourced schools that provide free rides for social workers because they see that as a social commitment of the institution. And I don't think that would change. I also think there'd be a lot of programs where maybe you're uncertain about what the economic outcomes for your students would be, but you still think it's important to offer it as part of your mission or part of the educational value you want to offer. Mm-hmm. And so you're saying, look, they're making thoughtful decisions. All of that said, none of what I was proposing is incompatible with something like we're seeing that was in the Senate reconciliation bill that's being voted on. You could still have, and I think that's the appropriate place to put accountability, is on the front end at the programmatic level. One of the big things I don't like about the House's proposal is, what does it do to disincentivize bad actors from offering bad programs? You have to pay more, but if you are, not picking on the for-profit sector, but for-profit sector is often very attuned to the share of federal money and what the profit margins are. You could build in a risk factor and just simply change your pricing model to account for it. Doesn't mean you're offering a better quality education, just means you've priced around what the impact would be. You would have the same thing. It really only benefits the students if you are preventing them from going to a bad program in the first place, taking out loans at a bad program before they lose eligibility. So to my mind, that aligns with what I'm talking about, and that's a right place to put that accountability.
So would you be okay with raising the Pell Grant, but also expanding the accountability of the income threshold test to be used for Pell Grant eligibility as well?
So first of all, let me say I'm here as John Fansmith, not as AC or on behalf of all.
We won't make you sign anything today. I'm just curious. I mean,
I'm being broadcast over YouTube. I don't think this is exactly a private conversation. No, I think that's exactly the sort of things we should be talking about too, yeah. Right? We have for a long time had a running argument about what is the appropriate level of grant aid and are we providing enough? And I think most people, especially most people who work with low-income students, would say, it's not enough, right? It's not enough to shield those people from the worst risk. It's not enough to incentivize the people who wouldn't participate from doing it. And that is a big increase in cost. So what is the trade-off, right? Like you have to have some sort of a concession. And I think a lot of schools, I talk to a lot of presidents who understand that, who are constantly thinking of ways to lower the cost to their students, to align what they're doing with what market credentials are needed. If we have a few more pushes in that area, I don't think that's something, change is difficult for everyone, but it's the sort of thing that, at least to my mind, I hear a lot of receptivity to, but it has to be matched with investment. We've tended to have people say, we're going to cut the aid amounts and increase accountability, or we want to increase the aid with no accountability. That middle ground is really where I think the solution lies.
Yeah, I understand what John is saying about there are certain things that institutions can't estimate with respect to how changes in the market and in the workforce have implications for the earnings outcomes of their students. Things like, I don't know, thousands of federal workers potentially being laid off who, majored in programs like political science or international relations and wanted to work at an agency like USAID, those types of things that you can't necessarily account for. But also I hear what you're saying, Beth, in terms of the framework we're looking at here is, should college graduates, completers of undergraduate programs, make more on average than their counterparts who just went to high school? And most individuals would I think, in a common sense way, answer yes to that question. We're supposed to be moving into the Q&A, but I just want to get really quickly here, sort of, this is the problem of leaving this question until last, but I wanted to ask at a certain point over the course of this conversation, we've seen what has happened when vast legislation in recent years has been passed and there wasn't necessarily the capacity on the federal government side, particularly on the education department side, to implement that policy in a way that doesn't hurt students. And I wonder if that's a concern for either of you with respect to implementing some of the accountability measures from the reconciliation bill at a time when the education department's workforce, among other agencies that could potentially be involved here, has been so vastly diminished, notwithstanding the court orders that are sort of creating new questions about what capacity looks like there.
I'll go first. I am very concerned about it. I mean, I think that there is a lot to be done for, if this bill is passed as is, implementation is not without further questions. And I would really love to see Congress move forward following the completion of the reconciliation process to take up bipartisan legislation, doing like sort of a cleanup bill on education policy, because I think there will be things to fix after this goes into effect. And some of that may be making some staffing corrections at the Department of Education. I'm not an expert on what personnel looks like over there or where the need is, but I do have significant concerns that the speed of the cuts will have left us with the department that's unable to effectively implement this legislation.
Yeah, I share Beth's concerns. I think there's a couple things to think about if, and again, the what's in this bill, the Senate version, is far less complicated than what the House had, but it still involves data from the Department of Education, data reported by institutions, data from the IRS, likely state data and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, all being aggregated, calculated with relevant sample sizes across tens of thousands of programs at thousands of institutions, and then accurate determinations being made over a multi-year period. The advantage is it would be 3 years before any decision about eligibility goes into effect. So there's time to get it right, but it took 2 years to get, actually it took longer than 2 years, 2 years from when it was supposed to start for FAFSA to get resolved mostly. And what we've seen, especially with the layoffs at the Department of Education, the thing that really worries me about that, not just the departmental staff, not just the fact that so many of the people who left were the most experienced and senior people there, but also they closed a lot of the regional federal student aid offices, which would be the places institutions would go to say, look, there's a problem, or you miscalculated this, or we don't understand why this failed. With those resources out of the way, it's not just the implementation, which will be a problem, but there will inevitably be a number of just back and forth that would have to happen as something launches, something that's complicated and big scale. And I don't know that on the back end, there's that support that's going to make that a smooth, seamless problem or process. And you can definitely anticipate a lot of problems.
Yeah, I learned it over the course of conversations with so many institutional leaders and students themselves in the last couple of years, just how policy implementation that is not entirely successful can have such detrimental effects for the most vulnerable populations. There are so many groups of students for whom, simply one tiny barrier is the difference between them going to college and not. Okay, I'm going to start to move to some of the questions that we have, some great questions that have been submitted to us via email and
Especially
over.
some hard ones for John. That would be my preference.
Great. Okay, there are a few. So this one's really interesting, and I've heard this from a couple of different groups since we've seen this legislation on the Hill start to take shape about workforce Pell and certificate programs. So they ask, the Senate bill seems to have left a gap in accountability between programs covered by short-term or workforce Pell and Title IV eligible programs that are not degree programs, i.e. diploma and certificate programs, which tend to be largely vocational. Do you know if this was intentional or an oversight? Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like sort of the workforce Pell proposal that was moving through the House with the support of Virginia Fox and Bobby Scott, Republican and a Democrat, was relatively bipartisan. I don't know when. A year ago, or a year and a half ago, 2 years, whenever it was first introduced. But there have been some concerns raised from consumer protection type advocate folks about that particular provision that have been resurfacing since we saw workforce Pell struck from the reconciliation bill and then added back just for accredited programs. So any thoughts on that disparity?
It's a really good question because I think it actually highlights a lot of the things we've been talking about these sort of dynamics around accountability. If you look at what's in the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, to be eligible as a program, a short-term program to receive Pell grants for your students, I mean, there are standards about, a 70% completion rate, 70% placement rate within 6 months of leaving the program. And these are actually very tough standards, tougher than we have for, any program, nonprofit, for-profit at the bachelor's level or anything else for these short-term programs. And it reflected that process you talked about, Zach, where it was bipartisan. Bobby Scott and Virginia Fox came together, and these kind of long-standing differences on the accountability space, Democrats being very suspicious of for-profit institutions, Republicans being very supportive of those institutions and their ability to have the same benefits under policy as nonprofit institutions. And so essentially the compromise was, we're going to open it to for-profit institutions, but we're going to put these really stringent quality standards on. And, you look at it, and I think one of the things we've heard from, a lot of institutions, particularly community colleges, is if you look at those thresholds and you apply them to a bachelor's program, they might not meet those standards. It's going to be hard for some of these programs to do that. And part of the reason this doesn't cost that much money, according to CBO, is there's probably not going to be that many programs that they're going to pursue it, they're going to put forward. So it's going to, in some ways, limit the benefit of what is really meant to be short-term, skills-based, quick economic boost to the student. That said, we're supportive of it. We think it is a very positive step. It might be another one of those ones like Beth was talking about, where we're coming back with some fixes to sort of better calibrate it to what's actually going on in the marketplace.
And I'll leave it at that. I'm not an expert on the workforce Pell portion, so that sounds good to me.
Yeah, it was a very strange bedfellows is the word that I very often use with respect to higher education policy. It's people you think would never agree on things, all of a sudden do, and then they don't, and it is endlessly fascinating. Another question, earnings premiums thresholds, this person asks, are seriously flawed when the threshold is the median age of working high school grads age 25 to 34. This creates a disincentive for higher ed to serve populations whose median wages for graduates appear to be impacted by discriminatory wage practices. Women, African Americans, and other demographics do often have much lower median wages than the overall population for a given earned degree. How should this be addressed in measuring the performance of programs that have high percentages of populations in this situation? is there something that, I don't know, maybe the department could do from a regulatory perspective that could potentially find a way to address that to the degree that there are people at the department able to work on such things and employed to work on such things? What do either of you have thoughts on that that element of this that I know you had raised before, John?
So I would say, and we have a little bit of experience with this at AC because we run the Carnegie classifications. And one of the things we just rolled out was a measure looking at what we call opportunity colleges and universities that are essentially institutions that do really well, both in terms of outcomes and access. And one of the things we looked at that was looking at comparing, really focusing on the students you served and their outcomes. So looking at a regional level in terms of like Pell recipients relative to poverty level in that area, where your students went and what their earnings were relative to the areas they went. And it's not, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's not that hard. We do it with existing federal data sets. And that's the kind of thing, again, if we had more time with this accountability measure, you could look at things that are better targeted. I mean, the idea that, and I think the person asked the question had it exactly right. If you are talking about somebody, say, getting a certificate program and comparing them to a 25 to 34-year-old high school graduate, that 25 to 34-year-old high school graduate may at that point be 16 years out of high school in a profession. If they're in a trade or something else, they could be earning a fair amount of money. And that's a great outcome. That's not a negative. But a comparison to a certificate graduate who might be 2 or 3 years out of that certificate program, 4 years past for the comparison purpose, it may not line up and say, well, this is actually an apples to apples kind of comparison of an equal earning opportunity. I think there are things you could do to mitigate that. I think there are things you could do to make it a more tight comparison and account for regional differences, poverty levels in different areas, what that looks like. It gets complicated. Federal policy is not great with complications, and you tend to see that in laws. They look for big pictures, red lines, not this sort of narrow targeted thing, but there are ways to get at it.
I think in this conversation, we often, and I'm guilty of this as well, imply that these sorts of metrics are getting at some sort of value added. That, like, when we do this earnings threshold test for institutions, we're saying, okay, you are a bad institution. You're doing a bad job because you failed this threshold, right? In reality, I think because of the issues that the commenter raised, as well as the other things we've talked more about in terms of occupation choice and things like that, that's not a fair characterization, even if that's kind of the shorthand that we use for these tests of eligibility. I think that because of these complicating factors that show up in measuring of outcomes at the college level, I would not like any policy that tried to rank or judge institutions' quality based on these outcomes in terms of being like excellent, great, good, better, not, not so good. I think we would fail in that exercise. And so I think the reason I like the version that we have is because, as I talked about in the very beginning, it is a very low bar, and it is such a low bar that it doesn't really function as kind of a measure of value add, even though that's sort of what it looks like. Instead, I think what it functions as is a consumer protection. And so I would say if you're an institution that disproportionately serves students who are affected by labor market discrimination, gender, racial, or otherwise, and your students on average tend to be facing outcomes that are so poor in the economy that they are worse off than had they just gone into the market, or worse off than the typical person with a high school diploma, then even if you are doing God's work, you may not be serving that student by enrolling them and allowing them to have access to that credit. So I think because this has been designed not to judge value add, but rather to just create this like very bottom line consumer protection level threshold, I like it because I think it satisfies these concerns, because it's not trying to do more than just say, in this case, a student will likely be worse off for having gone to that school. And yes, all of these things are true. Labor market discrimination exists, and it exists in a very real way. And maybe none of this is your fault, but the reality is, for these students, it is not in their interest to take on debt to pay for that program. And so I think we've got to be careful about the way that we talk about, these rules and how it measures quality at the institutions. And I should probably take that note for myself, because I'm sure I make that mistake, but it's an important one.
It can be really tough. It reminds me of my favorite story ever written about higher education from my former colleague, Emma Pettit, at the Chronicle of Higher Education, which was about a puppetry major at West Virginia University. It's called Is College for Puppets? And it's just about, maybe there's a way we could potentially send it to the folks in the group, but I think about it literally every day when I have a conversation about student loans, Pell Grants, accountability, negotiated rulemakings that go on forever and ever. I'm almost always thinking about the West Virginia University puppetry program. Yeah. Well, on that note, this has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate both of you for taking the time to chat and to, demonstrate that there's so much to unpack in the higher education policy space these days, and there are more areas of agreement, I think, than disagreement. We all care first and foremost about our students and faculty, and believe in what higher education can do. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and you'll be able to find this recording on YouTube for years to come, should you want to revisit anything that our wonderful panelists have said.